December 25th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The snow fell like ash over the Ardennes, not the gentle, crystalline snow of childhood memories or Christmas cards, but heavy, wet, relentless. It clung to the shattered trees, buried the frozen dead, and turned the cratered earth into a landscape that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead, but to something in between. A purgatory of mud and ice and blood. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, had raged for 9 days. 9 days of house-to-house slaughter, of tanks grinding through forests, of artillery that turned the night sky orange and made the ground shake like the wrath of God himself. The 101st Airborne had held Bastogne against impossible odds. Men of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions had fought in conditions so brutal that frostbite claimed nearly as many casualties as German bullets. And now, on Christmas Day, the guns had not stopped. They never truly stopped. They merely paused, exhausted like boxers leaning into each other in the final round, too tired to throw another punch, but unable to surrender. Behind the American lines, in what had once been a Belgian farming village called Foy, a makeshift prisoner-of-war camp had been established in the ruins. 3 barns, a collapsed granary, and a section of barbed wire hastily strung between shattered fence posts. Inside, huddled against the cold, were 237 German soldiers. Some were Waffen-SS, young, fanatical, their eyes still burning with the certainty of the Reich. But most were Wehrmacht, conscripts, boys from Bavaria and the Rhineland, who'd been told they were fighting for their homeland. Men who'd believed in victory once, but now believed only in survival. They sat on frozen straw, wrapped in whatever they could find: American blankets, torn Wehrmacht greatcoats, burlap sacks. The breath rose in clouds. Many were wounded. Bandages stained brown with old blood, faces gray with exhaustion and shock. The smell of gangrene and unwashed bodies mixed with the sharp chemical stink of cordite that still clung to their uniforms. They did not speak much. What was there to say? The war was lost. They knew it. Every man in that camp knew it, even if they couldn't yet say the words aloud. Germany was burning. Their families, if they still lived, were starving. The fatherland they'd been taught to die for had become a nightmare of rubble and corpses. And here they were, prisoners of the Americans. The same Americans they'd been told were mongrels, cowards, a soft people corrupted by jazz and democracy and Jewish propaganda. But the Americans had fought like demons. They had held.
And now the Germans waited. For what, they did not know. Transfer to a larger camp? Interrogation? Perhaps a bullet in the back of the head? No different than what the SS had done to American prisoners at Malmedy just days before. The guards were not cruel. That was the strange thing. They were not kind, either. War doesn't allow for kindness, but they were not cruel. They distributed what rations they could spare. They allowed the wounded to be treated by an American medic, a kid from Pennsylvania with shaking hands and 1,000-yard stare. They did not beat them, did not spit on them. It was worse than cruelty, in a way. It was indifference. The kind of indifference that comes when you've seen too many friends die, when you've held your buddy's guts in your hands and tried to push them back inside, when you've had to shoot a 19-year-old boy in the face because he was wearing the wrong uniform. The Americans didn't hate them anymore. They were just tired. Evening, December 25th, 1944. The sun never really rose that day, just a pale, gray light that filtered through the clouds and made the world look like an old photograph. By 1600 hours, It was already getting dark again. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Men stamped their feet and blew into their hands and dreamed of fires they would never see. Half a mile from the camp proper, in the village proper, stood the church of St. Martin, or what remained of it. The bell tower had been sheared off by German artillery 3 days prior. The roof was mostly gone, just blackened beams exposed to the sky like ribs. The stained glass windows had been blown out, replaced by rough boards and canvas tarps. The pews had been removed to make space for wounded soldiers, and the stone floor was still stained with blood from the makeshift aid station that had operated there during the siege. But the altar remained, and the crucifix, scorched, pitted with shrapnel, but standing. At 1800 hours, as darkness settled over the Ardennes like a shroud, a group of American soldiers gathered inside. There were perhaps 40 of them, men from different units, paratroopers from the 101st, tankers from the 10th Armored Division. Some still wore their helmets. Others had removed them, revealing hair matted with sweat and grime. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed. Many bore wounds, bandaged hands, limps, the vacant stare of shell shock. They had come to pray. Not because they were particularly religious, though some were, but because it was Christmas, and because they were alive, and because somewhere, thousands of miles away, their mothers and wives and children were sitting in warm churches singing hymns and pretending the world wasn't ending. A chaplain stood at the front. Captain Edward O'Brien, 101st Airborne Division. A Catholic priest from Boston with a thick accent and a gentle manner that somehow persisted, even here, in this frozen hell. He wore a mud-stained uniform with a cross on his collar and a rosary wrapped around his knuckles. He spoke briefly. Not a sermon. There was no energy for that. Just a few words about hope, about home, about the light that shines in darkness. And then he said, "Let us sing." There was a moment of hesitation. Singing felt absurd. Singing felt obscene somehow, with corpses still freezing in the fields outside, with the distant rumble of artillery on the horizon, with brothers buried in shallow graves or burned alive in tanks. But then a voice rose. Tenor, uncertain, cracking with exhaustion. "Silent night, holy night." It was Private First Class James McKinney, a rifleman from Kentucky, 22 years old. He'd sung in his church choir before the war. Another voice joined him, then another. "All is calm, all is bright." The sound was fragile at first, tentative, like something that might shatter if touched. But then it grew. 40 voices. 40 men who'd killed and watched their friends die. 40 men who'd been awake for 3 days straight, who'd eaten nothing but frozen K-rations and melted snow, who'd lost fingers to frostbite and faith to the things they'd seen. And they sang.
Round yon virgin, mother and child. The acoustics in the ruined church were strange. The missing roof let the sound escape, rising into the night sky. But the stone walls, ancient, thick, built to last, caught the melody and threw it outward, amplifying it, sending it rolling across the frozen fields, across the barbed wire, into the camp. The camp, 1815 hours. The first German to hear it was Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, a sergeant from Munich, 38 years old. He'd fought in Poland, France, Russia. He'd survived Stalingrad, one of the few. His hands were scarred from frostbite, his eyes perpetually tired. He was standing near the wire, smoking a cigarette he'd cadged from an American guard when the sound reached him. At first, he thought it was the wind, or his imagination. But then he recognized it. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht.
Silent night, holy night. The same hymn, the same melody he'd sung as a child in his mother's kitchen, the same song they'd sung in the trenches at Stalingrad while men froze to death in their foxholes. But this was in English. The Americans were singing. Richter stood very still, the cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. Other prisoners began to notice it. They moved toward the wire, drawn by the sound. Some stood, others crawled, too weak to walk. Sleep in heavenly peace. The voices carried across the snow with impossible clarity. 40 men singing in a language most of the Germans didn't understand. But the melody transcended language. It was a memory, a ghost, a reminder of something they'd lost. Unteroffizier Hans Becker, 19 years old, wounded in the shoulder, began to weep. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his frozen cheeks, cutting tracks through the grime. He wasn't alone. All around the camp, hardened soldiers, men who'd stormed beaches and burned villages, who'd learned to sleep through artillery barrages and eat their rations while standing over corpses, felt something break inside them. Feldwebel Otto Krause, a veteran of North Africa, sank to his knees in the snow. Private Werner Schmidt, a former school teacher conscripted in 1943, covered his face with his hands. Even some of the SS, the true believers, the ones who'd shouted Heil Hitler with genuine fervor, stood silent, their faces unreadable, something struggling behind their eyes. The song wasn't just music. It was a memory of who they had been before the war, before the propaganda and the killing and the endless nightmare of the Eastern Front. It was Christmas Eve in a warm house with a family that might now be ash. It was their mothers singing them to sleep. It was a world where men didn't freeze to death in ditches. It was everything they'd lost. And it was coming from the enemy, from the Americans they'd been taught to despise. And that, somehow, made it worse, made it unbearable. Because if the Americans could still sing, if they could still remember how to pray, how to find beauty in this frozen hell, then what did that say about the side the Germans had chosen? Silent night, holy night. The hymn continued, echoing across the darkness. And in the camp, 237 German soldiers stood in the snow and listened and wept.
Later, 1845 hours. The Americans finished singing. The last notes faded into the night, swallowed by the wind and the endless white silence of the Ardennes. Inside the church, the men stood for a moment, unsure what to do next. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply stared at the floor, lost in memory. Captain O'Brien said a final prayer. His voice was hoarse. Lord, bring us home. And if we cannot go home, then let us remember what home was. Amen. Amen, they echoed. The soldiers filed out into the night. The snow had started again. They pulled their collars tight and walked back to their positions, to their frozen foxholes and shattered tanks and endless guard shifts. They did not speak much, but something had changed, some small, indefinable thing. For a few minutes, they had not been soldiers. They had been men. Men who remembered Christmas. Men who still believed, however faintly, that the world could be more than blood and mud. The camp. Night. The German prisoners returned to their places in the barns, moving slowly like men in a dream. The guards watched them, puzzled by their silence. One American private, 18 years old, from Iowa, asked his sergeant what was wrong with them. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran from the 2nd Infantry Division, just shook his head. "They heard the singing," he said quietly. "So?" The sergeant lit a cigarette, his hands steady despite the cold. He had been at Omaha Beach, at St. Lo. He had seen things that would haunt him until the day he died. He said, "So they're starting to remember." "Remember what?" The sergeant looked at the barbed wire, at the silhouettes of the German soldiers huddled in the ruins. He said, "That they're human, same as us."
And most of those German prisoners would never see home again. Some would die in captivity from their wounds. Others would be transferred to camps in France, then Britain, then America. Many would not return to Germany until 1947, only to find their cities destroyed and their families gone. But in the years after the war, in letters and memoirs, and quiet conversations in veterans' halls, some of them would remember that night. They would remember standing in the snow on Christmas Day, 1944, behind barbed wire in a Belgian field, listening to their enemies sing. They would remember how the voices carried across the darkness like a prayer. They would remember how they wept, not from despair, but from something else, something they thought the war had killed in them. They would remember, for just a moment, feeling human again. That night, in a ruined church in Belgium, the guns of war fell silent, and for a moment, the world remembered how to pray. The snow had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a terrible stillness. At 0600 hours, the guards changed shifts at the POW camp. The men coming off duty moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, frost forming on their eyebrows and the wool of their scarves. Those taking their place were no better. The American Army had no winter uniforms when the Bulge began. They fought in standard-issue wool and canvas, in boots that let in water, with gloves that did nothing against the cold. Trench foot was epidemic. So was frostbite. So was a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than the body, a weariness of the soul. But something was different this morning. The German prisoners were awake. Not all of them. Some still slept the fitful sleep of the wounded, but many stood near the wire, watching the tree line, watching the Americans, watching the sky as it slowly changed from black to gray. Sergeant Michael Corso, 101st Airborne, noticed it immediately. Corso was from Philadelphia. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's bakery. He had a wife named Marie and a daughter he'd never met. She'd been born 3 months ago while he was in England preparing for market garden. He carried her photograph in his helmet, wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. He'd been at Normandy, at Holland, at Bostonia, where he'd gone 6 days without sleep and killed 11 German soldiers that he could confirm, maybe more. He was 26 years old and felt 60. As he walked the perimeter, his rifle slung over his shoulder, he saw Oberfeldwebel Richter standing by the wire. The German sergeant was staring at the church in the distance, or what remained of it. The broken tower, the collapsed roof, the smoke-blackened walls. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither man moved. Then, Richter did something unexpected. He nodded, just slightly. A small, deliberate gesture. Corso didn't know what it meant. Respect? Acknowledgement? Or just the simple recognition that they were both still alive against all odds? he found himself nodding back. They stood there, separated by barbed wire and the weight of history. Two men who would have killed each other without hesitation 48 hours ago. But something had shifted in the night. The wire was still there. The war was still there. The uniforms and the flags and the ideologies that had set the world on fire, all still there. But beneath it, for just a moment, there was something else. A thread of recognition. "We are the same," the silence said. "We are cold. We are afraid. We want to go home. We are human." Corso broke eye contact first. He continued his patrol, shoulders hunched against the wind. But he would remember that moment for the rest of his life.
The thaw came unexpectedly, a brief reprieve as temperatures climbed above freezing for the first time in weeks. The snow turned to slush. The ground became mud. The corpses, frozen in grotesque poses for days, began to smell again. Burial details worked throughout the day. American dead were wrapped in canvas and tagged. German dead were simply counted and laid in mass graves. There were too many. There had always been too many. At the POW camp, conditions remained grim. The American supply situation was still desperate. Bastogne had been surrounded for days, and while Patton's Third Army had broken through on the 26th, it would take time for supplies to reach the front. Food was scarce. Medicine was scarcer. The wounded German prisoners were suffering. An American medic, that same kid from Pennsylvania, whose name was Tommy Walsh, did what he could with the supplies he had. But gangrene was setting in for some. Infections were spreading. Walsh worked 18-hour shifts, moving from prisoner to prisoner, changing bandages with hands that trembled from exhaustion. He was 19 years old. He'd wanted to be a veterinarian before the war. Now he spent his days trying to save men who'd been trying to kill him a week ago. It made no sense. But nothing made sense anymore. One of the prisoners, a young Gefferter named Paul Zimmerman, shot through the lung at the edge of Foy, was dying. Everyone knew it. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, but infection had set in. He was burning with fever, delirious, calling for his mother in German.